We begin the Gemara today on Daf Lamed Ches Samad Aleph, towards the top of the Amud, where it says, Oma Shmuel. So the Gemara here is speaking about the halacha of Erev Tchumen on Yontif as far as it relates to any objects that you want to move from one place to another on Yontif, and the object is owned by one individual, and then there's someone else that's using it, or borrowing it, or you give it to a shepherd, or a buyer, various different cases that the Mishnah discussed. So the Gemara brings here another halacha. Oma Shmuel shiur shel patam, an ox that belongs to a fattener. These are people that fatten the oxes with the intention to sell them, and everybody knows about this. They have a name that they sell oxen, and people come from not only this city but from all around to buy these oxen. So then areo keragle kol adam. So the tchum of these oxen, even someone that bought it on Yontif, the tchum will be determined according to the buyer, not according to the fattener, which is the seller, because from before Yontif, he didn't intend to keep it for himself. He's selling it to people from his own city, people from many other surrounding cities that are coming to buy from him. So this was what it was destined for even when Yontif came in, and therefore the tchum will go according to the buyer. But if it's a shiur shel royeh, if it's an ox that belongs to a shepherd, says Rashi says, a shepherd usually keeps the oxen for himself, but sometimes, from time to time, he sells. But even if he sells, who buys from him? Only people from his city. People from surrounding cities don't know about him. He doesn't have a name that people come to buy from him. So even if you're going to say that people from his own city intended to buy from him and he intended to sell to them, but not the people from surrounding cities that don't know of him. So therefore, harehu ragle oisa ha'ir. If people buy from him, so then the tchum is going to be measured according to the people of that city, that you can go there tchum. But if someone from a different city comes to buy from him, so then you can't establish the tchum according to that person, because when Yontif came in, that's not something that was planned or intended, because like I said, the royeh is someone that people from far away don't know of him. So the Gemara, the next thing it said in our Mishnah, Hashayil keli mechaveiroi me'erev Yontif. If you borrow a keli from your friend from before Yontif, so then the tchum follows the status of the borrower. You already borrowed it from before Yontif, so it's in your possession then. Frek the Gemara pshita, isn't this obvious? Of course, if it's already in your possession from before Yontif, so why should it not be according to the status of your tchum? So the Gemara answers, Lo yitzricha, the chiddush in our Mishnah is in the following case, Shalei masrei loi ela b'Yontif, that you spoke to the lender about borrowing this keli before Yontif, but you didn't actually borrow it until Yontif itself. So Mao the Tema, I would think to say, Lav b'reshusei oikmei, that when Yontif came in, he didn't yet place it into your possession, so even though you spoke to him about this and you made up that you're going to borrow it, but since it's not yet physically in your possession, it should still retain the tchum of the lender. Kamash Malon, that's the chiddush of our Mishnah. Once they made this up before Yontif, that's what it was designated for, and therefore it follows the tchum of the borrower, even though he only actually got it on Yontif. So this pshat in our Mishnah here is a raya to what Rabbi Yochanan said. Rabbi Yochanan said this halacha. Hashayil keli mechaverim erev Yontif. If you borrow a keli from your friend from before Yontif, even if the lender didn't actually give it to you until Yontif itself, it gets the tchum of the borrower, since they already had made this up from before Yontif, so it follows the borrower's tchum. The next halacha said in the Mishnah, b'Yontif, if he borrowed it on Yontif itself, keragle hamashal, so then it follows the tchum of the mashal, of the lender, since he borrowed it only on Yontif. Frek the Gemara pshita, isn't this obvious as well? And Rashi explains that what this Mishnah over here means is that they only spoke about this on Yontif. Just like in the Reisha we said that the case where the borrower borrowed before Yontif means that he didn't actually physically receive the keli before Yontif, but they spoke about it before Yontif. So here, in the next part of the Mishnah, where it says that he borrowed it on Yontif, so that means that not only did he receive the keli Yontif, but they only spoke about it on Yontif. So if so, obviously, if only on Yontif they spoke about it, so when the time Yontif came in, it has the tchum of the owner, of the lender. So it's obvious that it has this tchum. So the Gemara answers, Lo yitzricha, the chiddush over here is, De rogel v'shal minei. This borrower is always accustomed to borrowing from this person. So therefore I would think to say, even before you actually came and spoke to him about it to you, he's expecting that you're going to come and ask to borrow this, and therefore he already in his mind intended that it's going to be lent to you, and he already places it into your possession, and therefore it follows the tchum of the borrower that's always accustomed to borrow from him. Kamash Malan, so therefore the Mishnah is telling me that we can't rely on such a svara. Why not? Because we can say, Meima Omar, the lender, the owner, says to himself, Dilme mashke chinish achrine. He didn't come to me before Yom Tiv. Maybe he found someone else to borrow this keli from. So I'm not going to be lending him this keli this time around. So I'm not intending to give it to him for this Yom Tiv. Again, mashke chinish achrine. He found somebody else and he borrowed from someone else. So therefore, even if it's someone that's accustomed to borrowing from you, but if you did not speak to him explicitly before Yontif, it will follow the tchum of the owner, because at the time that Yontif came in, it was his, and you didn't speak to him at all about it. The next thing it said in the Mishnah is V'chein ha'isha sheshala mechaverta. A woman that borrows from her friends ingredients. She has her dough and she borrows whether water or salt for her dough. Or then the Mishnah said she borrowed spices for the cooking. So what did the Mishnah say? The tchum will follow both her own tchum for the ingredients that she's putting into the cooking, and her friend's tchum, which is for the salt or water or the spices. So the Gemara now shares the following incident. Kisalik Rab Abba. When Rab Abba was heading out to Eretz Yisrael, or when he was already on the way, Rashi says. So Omar, he said as follows, Yehei Rave, let it be the will of Hashem, the Eime Milse, the Tiskabel, that I should be able to say something to the Chachamim there in Eretz Yisrael when I arrive there, that they should accept my words. So what happened? So here, as we'll see in the Gemara, the Mishnah, this halach of the Mishnah came up, and Rab Abba said something about it, and a huge discussion will ensue over here in the Gemara about this. Before we go into the actual Gemara, let me just frame what the Gemara is going to be speaking about over here, so we have a little bit of an introduction what's going on. It's a little bit of a complex piece of Gemara over here. Everybody knows of the concept of bittul berayv, when it comes to something which is asr and something which is mutter. So if you have something which is asr that falls into something which is mutter, and there's a rayv there's a majority against this, so it becomes batal. That's the halach of bittul berayv. Now, the question is, does bittul berayv apply to ownership? When you have ownership of something, and that thing that's owned falls into something else that's owned by someone else, could I say the concept of bittul berayv there as well? So, I mean, obviously, you would say, of course not. What do you mean? For example, if I own $200, and then someone else's $100 falls and gets mixed into this $200, so I can say to the owner, well, your $100 got mixed into my $200, it's bittul berayv, goodbye, I don't owe you the money. Of course you don't say such a thing. But now let's think about Erev Tchumen. So over here, it's a more complex issue. By Erev Tchumen, if you would want to apply the concept of bittul berayv, which is very relevant to the case we're speaking about over here, you have the dough, and then you're mixing in some salt or some water from the friend. So the water and the salt is a minority. The main ingredients of the dough is what this woman had for herself. So we're dealing with a case of bittul berayv. But now the question over here is, what is this concept of Erev Tchumen? Is this a Isser concept where bittul berayv should apply? Is this an ownership concept where bittul berayv should not apply? On one hand, the Tchumen is a Isser. It's a question of Isser. I'm not allowed to walk out of my Tchum. And the question is, how do I determine that Tchum? According to one person, according to another person, it's a subject of Isser. On the other hand, though, but how do you determine a tchum? You determine the tchum by the owner, by ownership. According to the owner, if I am the owner when the time Yom Tov comes in, that determines the tchum of this object. So doesn't the ownership determine the tchum? And if ownership determines the tchum, isn't ownership something that does not become batal? Now, it goes a step further. This seemingly obvious rule that when it comes to ownership, there is no such a thing as bittul berayv, it's not necessarily so simple. If there's an issue of bittul berayv that you want to apply to ownership in a case where you're going to steal money from someone, to someone that's claiming the money, and you want to take away money from someone. So obviously there's no concept of bittul b'roiv there. But how about if you want to apply the concept of bittul b'roiv regarding ownership, and it doesn't affect anybody's claim on this money? It's not going to affect anybody's claim. So maybe you could apply the concept of bittul b'roiv even regarding ownership, as long as it doesn't affect anybody's claim. So that's yet another way to look at it. So over here, when it comes to the tchumen, you're not going to be affecting anybody's rights of ownership or claim that they have in it. So this is just a little bit to frame the discussion of the Gemara that's coming up over here. There's obviously more details and more in the structure of the Gemara, but just to keep this in mind of what's coming here, so the Gemara will flow. So now what happened? So Kisalik, when Rab Abba actually came to Eretz Yisrael, Ashkeche l'Rab Yochanan v'Rab Chanina bar Papi v'Rab Zeda. He found all of these Amirayim sitting together. Amrila, others say that it was Rabbi Vahu and Rab Shimon ben Pazi, Rab Yitzchak Nafcha, and V'Yasvi v'Kamri. And they were sitting and they were saying, they asked the following question on our Mishnah here regarding this case where the woman was making a dough and she was also using ingredients of water or salt for the dough from her friend. And what did the Mishnah say? That the tchum follows both. You have to follow the tchum of this lady that put in the main ingredients for the dough, and also the tchum of the one that she borrowed from, the water and or the salt. So the question was, why do you have to follow the tchum of this water or the salt? Shouldn't that water or salt, which is the minority of the ingredients here, become bottle, just like the concept we always have of bittul b'roiv? In other words, their approach was, we're dealing with a subject of an isser, the isser of tchumen, where you're allowed to walk to on Yontif. So regarding a subject of isser, there should be a concept of bittul b'roiv, and therefore you should say that the main ingredients of the dough establishes where the isser is, and the water and the salt is rendered insignificant. That was their question. So Amalu Rabbabe answered them, and he said, and he gave the following example. Harei shenis arav loy kav chitten ba'asara kavim chitten shochavere. What happens if you have a person that has one kav, a certain measure of wheat, and that one measure of meat got mixed into 10 kavin of wheat that his friend has? So that now it got mixed. Now here, what's the issue? Here there's no isser involved. Here it's a question of money, monetary rights, the ownership over here of this one kav of chitten that got mixed into the 10 kav of chitten from his friend. So now, yoichel halav v'chadi? So this individual could now eat and just be happy and say to his friend, sorry, your kav of chitten got mixed into mine, it's bittul b'roiv, I don't have to return it to you. Of course you don't say that. It's a matter of ownership. And therefore, it belongs to him. There's no such a thing as bittul b'roiv if there's somebody that's claiming the rights of this money that it belongs to him. So in essence, what Abba was trying to say to these chachamim was, over here in the Mishnah, since when it comes to tchumen, you determine the tchum according to the ownership of this object, so therefore over here, regarding ownership, there's no such a thing as bittul b'roiv. That's what he really intended to say. Okay, but what happened? Achichu alei. These chachamim laughed at his answer. They didn't accept it. Not only they didn't accept it, they laughed at him. Amaluhu, Rabbabe was very embarrassed by this. He says, Gulsaichu shakli. I took your garment away from you, that you're laughing from me. Hadar achichu alei. They continued laughing at him. They did not at all accept the premise of his answer. We see over here an interesting thing. That Abaye's tefillah, that he davened, that his words of Torah should be accepted by the Chachamim in Eretz Yisrael, was not accepted. The Chassam Sofer says that the reason is because when Abaye said that what was the language that he said in his tefillah? He said, Yeheirava the Eime Milsa de Teskabel. Eibusha should help that the words of Torah that I say should be received well. So the Chassam Sofer says, Abaye should have rather said, Yeheirava, that the words that I say should be true, that I should be mechaven alamis. The fact that he said that my words should be received, so to some degree, to some subtle degree, we're dealing with Abaye over here, or with Rab Abba that is, he was thinking about his words being received. and therefore his tefillah was not accepted. As we see, not only wasn't accepted, the exact reverse happened. They laughed at him. But now, as I said, there'll be a long discussion over here regarding this subject. So what in fact is this issue of tchumen, and when we're dealing with bittul beroiv regarding the ingredients of the tchumen? Is this a matter of iser? Is this a matter of ownership? And even if it is a matter of ownership, maybe it should be bottle, maybe it should not be bottle. But before we come to that discussion, there's another question that Rav Oishia asks, and as the Mefarshim explained, the Rishayim explained, the Meiri explains, that Rav Oishia sort of misunderstood what Abaye was intending to say, and therefore he asks a completely different question. Let's see. So Rav Oishia says, Shapir Ovid achichu alei. These Chachamim were right that they laughed at his answer. And the reason they laughed is as follows. Why, when he gave an example for these Chachamim, did he give an example of wheat getting mixed into wheat? Why didn't he give an example of wheat getting mixed into barley? Okay, so now the basis of what Rabbi Shi is speaking about, as Rashi brings, and the Gemara quotes here, is a machlekes of Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanon in the Gemara in Menachos regarding this halacha of bittul beroiv. The Rabbi Yehuda, that is, holds that bittul beroiv does not apply when it's a min b'minai. When there are two of the same type that one falls into the other, there's no bittul beroiv. He learns it from a pasuk. Whereas the Chachamim hold, bittul beroiv applies whether it's min b'minai, whether it's min b'she'enim minai, it doesn't matter. There's always bittul beroiv. Rav Oishia understood that what Rab Abba was trying to say with his example was, with chitin, falling into chitin, he was giving them an example of two of the same min, and he was trying to say to them that in our Mishnah, we consider it to be a case of min b'minai, and therefore, over here, bittul beroiv does not apply. That's what he was trying to say. In other words, not the point that I said before that he was saying regarding the difference between an isser matter or an ownership matter. Rather, he was focusing on the fact that according to Rabbi Yehuda, there is no bittul beroiv when it's min b'minai. That's what he was saying. So therefore, what Rav Oishia asks on that is as follows. Why did Rab Abba not give an example of wheat falling into barley? Because that's one type falling into a different type. Bottle. And in a case where it's one min and another min, there everybody agrees. Even Rabbi Yehuda agrees that it's going to be bottle. If so, chitin bechitin nami. Even if it's wheat and wheat, and it's the same min, nihi del Rabbi Yehuda lay bottle. Even if it's true that according to Rabbi Yehuda, min b'minai is not bottle, but we don't pass it like Rabbi Yehuda. L'Rabbanon miftal bottle. According to the Rabbanon, just like by a min b'she'enim minay there's bittul beroiv, by a min b'minay there's also bittul beroiv. So therefore, in our Mishnah, even if you're going to consider the water and the salt falling into or being included in the ingredients of this dough to be min b'minai, it should still be bottle, according to the opinion of the Rabbanon. And the truth is that the Rishayim discussed this, that over here, this itself, that the water and the salt with the other ingredients of the dough should be considered to be min b'minai, in itself is not such a pashta thing. I mean, simply it's not exactly min b'minai. You have flour, then you have water, and then salt. It's not the same min. But even if you're going to say, because ultimately it gets mixed together and it makes up one dough, so it is considered to be min b'minai, still, Rabbi Shi is asking, we paskin like the Chachamim, that min b'minai is bottle. So therefore, the bittul should apply here as well. So Rabbi Shia apparently held, like the premise of the Chachamim in Eretz Yisrael, that when it comes to Tchumen, it's obviously a question of Isser. Till where's the Isser that I can go with this Isser of Tchumen? Elamai, so the question is, if so, it should be bottle. So he understood the only way Rab Abba could be answering this is that maybe it's considered to be min b'minai. And therefore he asks the question, but min b'minai is also bottle, because we paskin like the Rabbanan. That's Rabbi Shia's question. But now Rav Safra responds to Rabbi Shia and says, no, I disagree. Rab Abba has a point. Amalei Rav Safra. So Rav Safra says to Rabbi Shia, Moshe, Shaper, Ka'omrit. So Moshe, Rashi says, is a terminology used as a shvua. He's saying like in the name of Moshe. I swear in the name of Moshe. Shape ka'omrit, is what you're saying true? In other words, this question that these Chachamim had on the Mishnah, that it should be batal b'roiv, is a good question, and Rav Abba's point was not a good point. And he brings him the following, and here, as we'll see, the main point that Rav Safra is going to try to make is that when it comes to the matters of ownership, there is no concept of bittul b'roiv. He brings a very specific example, and I'll explain soon what the reason for this specific example is, but this is the main point of what he's trying to say. That you misunderstood what Rav Abba was saying. Rav Abba was trying to say that tchumen is determined by ownership. And therefore, regarding the ownership, you have the two ingredients that are two different ownerships. There is no concept of bittul b'roiv. So let's see the example that he brings. Did you not hear what Rab Chia Kutusva said in the name of Rav? If you go and you select out the pebbles from a person's pile of grain. Now, seemingly you might say, pebbles? All I took out was pebbles. What are pebbles? They're negligible. They have no value to it. But it's not so. And if you take out those pebbles, then chayev l'shalom loy dmei chitim. You have to pay him back, not the value of those pebbles, but you have to pay him back the value of the wheat, of grain that you took out. Why? Alma, what I see from this is, kilo chasrei, that you have diminished the measure of this. You have diminished the measure of this grain that this person would sell. As Rashi explains, when you come to sell this grain and it's going to be weighed and there's a certain amount of pebbles that are always mixed into fresh grain that was just taken from the ground, so that pebbles adds to the weight of it. And when you went and picked out all those pebbles, so now the owner of this grain loses all his money. Not all, he loses that amount of weight from those pebbles that you took out. So even though the pebbles seem to be negligible, and you might come and say, hey, those pebbles, the batal b'roiv, I took out just a little bit, it's nothing. But the fact is, it takes away a certain amount of weight. So there's an ownership here, there's money, monetary value that you took away. So you can't say batal b'roiv, even if it's that negligible like pebbles. So if so, the same thing over here, hanami over here as well, kilo chasrei. If you're going to apply the concept of bittul b'roiv over here regarding this salt or this water, that might in your eyes be negligible in contrast to most of the ingredients. You might say it's bittul b'roiv and it's negligible and therefore it's not that we shouldn't pay attention to it. No, but no, if you're going to be mevatel that b'roiv, so then you're taking something that has ownership. There's someone that she borrowed this from, and there's ownership to this, and you're considering it like nothing. Regarding ownership, we don't say bittul b'roiv. So the point that Rav Safra was trying to say is, since over here we're dealing with tchumen, and the issa of tchumen is determined by ownership, regarding ownership, there's no such a thing as bittul b'roiv. The reason why he's bringing specifically this example of the pebbles is because he wants to make the point, even if you're going to say that it's something that's not only its ownership, but it's something that's very negligible, like those pebbles, but nevertheless, it doesn't matter how small it is. The fact is, it has a certain value, and therefore it never becomes batal when it comes to ownership. The same thing over here with the salt. It doesn't matter how little the salt might have been mixed into it. The fact is, the salt has someone's ownership in it. And that's what determines the Erev Tchumen. It can't be batal b'roiv. There's no such a thing. So therefore, there is no bittul b'roiv when it comes to this matter of Erev Tchumen. That's what Rav Safra says. Amalei Abaye. So Abaye argues with Rav Safra's point. Abaye says, look, this whole idea over here, that when it comes to ownership, there's no such a thing as bittul b'roiv. You know why that is? Because you're taking someone's money. There's someone that's claiming this money. That's the issue. Amalei Abaye, but v'leishani le'lemar. According to you, to Rav Safra, is there no difference bein mamen sheyesh le'tovin when you're dealing with ownership of money, where there's someone that's claiming this money, l'mamain she'ein le'tovin, to a situation where there's money? True, there's a matter of money, of ownership here, but it's not money that anybody is claiming here. That's not the issue of stealing or anyone that's claiming this money. So what Abaye is saying is, Rav Safra made the point, the concept of bittul b'roiv applies only to strictly issues of isser v'heter. When it comes to a matter of ownership, there's no concept of bittul b'roiv whatsoever. Comes Abaye and says, no, I disagree. You could apply the concept of bittul b'roiv to concept of isser, and you could apply the concept of bittul b'roiv regarding a concept of ownership as well. That a small ownership that's batal to the roiv of the ownership will be batal. When do you say that by ownership there's no such a thing as bittul b'raiv? If there's someone that's claiming monetary loss here, like in that example that Rav Safra brought, where there's pebbles, even if it's batal b'raiv and the rest of the grain there, but there's actual monetary loss that he had here because now the weight is less, so there's real monetary loss that he's claiming. So over there's no batal b'raiv. But over here, when it comes to the aid of tchumen, there's no monetary loss that we're dealing with over here. Over here, you're borrowing the salt, you're borrowing the water to put into the ingredients. You're going to pay it back to her after Yom Tif. That's a separate thing. Of course, you're going to give it back to her after Yom Tif. Over here, we're dealing with the Isser of tchumen, and the question is, yes, the Isser of tchumen is determined by ownership, and therefore it's also determined by the ownership of this salt or water that you borrowed. However, the ownership over here that we're using for Eid of Tchumen is not a matter of monetary loss. It's not relevant to anyone that's claiming this money right now. You're going to pay back that money after Yom Tov. But right now what's relevant is that this ownership is going to determine the Eid of Tchumen. So in such a case, when we're dealing with ownership, but the issue is not monetary loss, maybe over here there is a concept of bittul b'raiv, even regarding ownership, even regarding monetary ownership, and therefore the question of the Chachamim was a good question. That in our Mishnah, the salt and the water should be bottled in the dough. Even regarding ownership, you should say the concept of bittul b'raiv. That's a biased question here. Amalei, so Rav Safra disagrees with this, and Rav Safra here will say that no, when it comes to the concept of bittul b'raiv, ownership doesn't matter whatsoever. It doesn't matter if there is a claim, if there's no claim. There is no such a thing as ownership being relevant when it comes to bittul b'raiv. Ownership plays no role b'chlal. And he brings him the following proof. According to your reasoning that there is relevance to ownership when it comes to bittul b'raiv, I could apply bittul b'raiv to ownership. If so, Rav Chisda. This that Rav Chisda said. Now, the Gemara here is going to bring a very specific example of bittul b'raiv, and the Rishonim discuss why the Gemara chooses specifically this example. Maybe I'll explain soon. But basically, the Gemara is going to bring one example of bittul b'raiv, and Rav Safra will make the point that when it comes to bittul b'raiv, we apply bittul b'raiv by Isser regardless of ownership status. Ownership doesn't make whatsoever any difference. But as I said, the Gemara brings up a very specific example. So let's see what this example is. Nevela betela b'shchuta. Nevela meat, which is of course meat that was not shechted properly, so that nevela meat becomes bottled to shchuta. So there's a few things to be said here to understand what the Gemara is saying. First of all, this Gemara is going according to the opinion of Rav Yehuda, which we quoted before, that says that by a min b'minai, there's no bittul b'raiv. There's only bittul b'raiv if it's min b'she'ena minai, two different types. Okay, so now when it comes to nevela and shchuta, are these both the same type or are they not the same type? So the Gemara will explain here, it depends if the nevela fell into the shchuta or the shchuta falls into the nevela. That's one point, one introduction here. Another point of introduction is that when the Gemara here speaks about this nevela and shchuta, we're only speaking about the bittul b'raiv of the nevela and shchuta as it relates to the halachas of tumah and tara. We're not speaking about whether you would be allowed to eat it or not, but we're speaking about the halacha of tumah and tara. Meat that was shechted properly does not give off any tumah. Meat that's nevela is a avat tumah. It gives off tumah. So the discussion of the bittul over here is regarding the tumah. So now, the Gemara says, Rav Chisda said, according to Rav Yehuda, nevela betela b'shchuta. Nevela meat will become bottled to the shchuta meat. If nevela meat fell into shchuta meat, we consider the shchuta meat to be a different min. And again, according to Rav Yehuda, the rule is as long as what it fell into is a different min, it becomes bottled. So the shchuta meat is a different min. Why is it a different min? There's never a possibility that this shchuta meat should become a nevela. So it's a different min. Not even potentially could it ever become like the nevela. Once it was shechted, it's never going to be something that's metame, like nevela, which is metame. So therefore it becomes bottled in the shchuta meat, and it will not be metame. However, if what happens is, if the reverse happens, shchuta Eina betela benevela. If the shchuta meat is what fell into the nevela meat, so then what do I say? That the shchuta that fell into the nevela is considered to be the same min as the shchuta. The shchuta now fell into nevela, which is the same min. It's not. So the Gemara explains, Rav Chisda says, Lefisha efsher lenevela sheteyasa shchuta. As far as the halacha of tum is concerned, it is possible for a nevela to become a shchuta. How is a nevela becoming a shchuta when it comes to the halacha of tum? So Rashi here brings the halacha when it comes to nevela meat is that it only is metame when it's roi lachila, if it's fit for eating. If it's not roi lachila, it's not metame anymore. If it totally spoils, you learn it from a pasuk, that only then is it metame. But if it's not roi lachila, it's not metame. Okay? So therefore, when the nevela meat falls into the, when the shchuta meat that is, when the shchuta meat falls into the nevela, again, let me see again the lashon of the Gemara here inside. Again, shchuta eina betela benevela. Again, when the shchuta meat falls into the nevela meat, so then it will not be bottle. Why? Because potentially this nevela meat could have the same status as the shchuta meat. If it'll become spoiled, and then it will not be metame, just like the shchuta meat is not metame. So even if something just potentially could become similar to the other min that falls into it, according to Rabbi Yehuda, that's going to be considered min b'minai, and it will not be bottle. So therefore, in such a case, that it's going to be a suffix tumah, because once the shchuta fell in, it's not bottle, so this will be suffix tumah. And Rashi brings what an afkemina, whether it's vadei tumah or suffix tumah, b'negeya to the halacha of truma. Okay, it's not relevant to whole edichas here now, but the point is that it does not become bottle. Okay, so this is an example of bittul beroiv that the Gemara brings up over here according to Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. So now Rav Safra continues and explains that so hachanami. Over here in this case, are you going to argue and say, Dichi Islay, Bailim, Loi, Betela, that over here, even in a case where it's min b'she'ena mina, and it should become bottle, right? In the case where the shchuta meat, or where the nevela meat that is, fell into the shchuta meat, so it's min b'she'ena mina, and therefore it should be bottle. Are you going to argue now that if the nevela meat has one owner, and the shchuta meat has a different owner, so not just because there's different ownership, so therefore there's no din of bittul beroiv anymore, because it's a different owner? Of course you can't say that. The concept, what Rav Safra is trying to prove is that when it comes to the subject of bittul beroiv, the concept of bittul beroiv was learned in the Torah and said specifically for Isser v'heter. The relevance of ownership doesn't come in b'chlal. Who the owner over here is not going to change anything. So over here in this case, if the nevela meat is owned by one person and the shchuta meat is owned by another person, that's not going to change whether you say bittul beroiv or not. If they're owned by the same person or by two different people, the bittul beroiv is going to be the same. If it's min b'minai, it's bottle. It's according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's not bittul beroiv. If it's not min b'minai, it is bittul beroiv. So the ownership does not matter. Not like Abaye said. Abaye came and said that when it comes to ownership, you do apply the concept of bittul beroiv, and ownership does matter. Only time I say that by ownership I can't say bittul beroiv is when you're taking away money from someone. But if you're not taking away money from someone, then ownership does matter by bittul beroiv. So what Rav Safra is saying is, over here when it comes to the din of Issa v'heter, I see that ownership is irrelevant, doesn't play a role whatsoever when it comes to bittul beroiv. If so, coming back to our Mishnah, when our Mishnah is discussing a matter which is actually only about ownership, it's not a matter of Issa v'heter, it's only a matter of ownership. So over here, the concept of bittul beroiv was not said regarding ownership. Just like by Isser, where there is a concept of bittul beroiv, ownership is irrelevant to that concept of bittul beroiv. Ownership doesn't change whether it is bottle or is not bottle. When it comes to a case where I'm talking about ownership, which is what tchumen is, it's the ownership that determines the eid of tchumen, the tchum, not the eid of tchumen, but the tchum of the yontif. So over here, for sure, the same thing. the concept of bittul b'roiv does not apply to ownership whatsoever. And it doesn't matter if there's someone that's losing money out of this or is not losing money out of it. There's no inyan of bittul b'roiv regarding ownership. That's what Rav Safra is trying to prove out of all of this. Now, why the Gemara brings up specifically this example of the inyan of tumah regarding nevela meat and shchuta meat, so the Rishonim say because by the nevela and shchuta where it's tumah has a very powerful koyach. The moment you touch tumah, it affects what touches it. So I would think maybe over here there shouldn't be the concept of bittul b'roiv because of the koyach of the tumah, and therefore there would be a similar svara b'nigeya to the salt or the tavlin that it's speaking about in our Mishnah, which also adds a taste and has a certain koyach that it affects the entire ingredients. So that's the comparison of this case of the tumah and the case of our Mishnah, which is speaking about salt and the spices that have also an effect on the entire ingredients. Okay, so now the Gemara continues. Rav Safra asks on Abaye even more. Now, even if you're going to argue and say that no, ownership is relevant over here, that really there is bittul b'roiv regarding ownership, that is. And the only time there's no bittul b'roiv regarding ownership is if there's someone that has some monetary loss. But otherwise, there is bittul b'roiv when it comes to ownership. So the Gemara says, no, but over here, when it comes to Erev Tchumen, it anyways doesn't matter. For a different reason. And the Gemara explains, because V'hatanya, we learned in Abraise, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri said the following halacha regarding Erev Tchumen. Cheftzei hefker, when you have an object that's totally hefker, and it's at the beginning of Shabbos or Yontiv, is found in a certain place, ownerless. Kainen shvisa, it establishes its shvisa in that place, and now on Shabbos or Yontif, if anyone wants to take this object on Yontif and he wants to take this object to any place, he could only take it as far as the tchum of this object was in that place. Even though when Shabbos and Yontif came in, it was ownerless. So what established its tchum? But nevertheless, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is mechadish that we consider it as if it had ownership to it. So afal pi she'ein lehem bailim, even though it has no ownership to it, daimen kimi sheyesh lehem bailim. We treat it as if it had an owner to it when Yontif and Shabbos and Yontif came in, and therefore it has a status of a tchum in the place that it is. So this is a unique chiddush regarding Erev Tchumen, that even though it has no owner, and l'chayda, the whole entire concept of tchum is established by an owner, but nevertheless, even without an owner, we consider it as if it had an owner in that spot, and therefore it establishes its tchum in that area. So therefore, what Rav Safra is telling Abaye is that over here, in our Mishnah, even if you're going to say that over here there's nobody that's claiming this, and therefore there's nobody that this ownership doesn't matter to anybody, so let's make believe as if nobody owns this salt and water that was added to the ingredients. And now let's just look at the Isser. Look at the Isser of Tchumen, and therefore let's say that it should be Batal B'roiv Mitzad the Isser. But it's not so. When it comes to Tchumen, and I see that Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says that even something that has no ownership whatsoever, but nevertheless we consider it as if it has ownership to it. So therefore we should say the same thing regarding this salt and this water that's being added to the ingredients over here, that even though you might say that it doesn't matter to anybody else about this sort of salt and water was mixed now into this ingredients of this dough, and it only matters to this person now that wants to take it to the place they want to go, but the original owner that owns this salt and water that you borrowed it from, their ownership should matter and should determine this status of the tchum of the dough that you mix their ingredients into. And really, it's sort of a kal v'chomer. If when it comes to an item which is hefker, I mean, Taisus really makes this point that you sort of have to say that it's a kal v'chomer, because the Gemara here brings a statement from Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, and we don't even paskin like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. The Chachamim disagree with Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. But the point is, if Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri was saying that when it comes to an object which is hefker, and therefore this object, and nevertheless, even this object that's hefker, we say that it's as if somebody owns it right now and it establishes the tchum in the spot where this object of hefker is, how much more so when it comes to this salt and water, which is not totally hefker, it was borrowed from somebody. So it makes sense to say that even though no one's claiming this money, you're not stealing money from anyone, but there's someone that you're borrowing this from. There's an owner that this is coming from. So for sure, you can't say that it's insignificant. And when Shabbos or Yontif here came in, there was someone that owned this. And even if now you're going to say that their ownership doesn't matter because you don't really have a claim over it, but it should be strong enough that it should not become batal b'raiv, as if there's someone that's claiming it, as if there's someone that wants to take it. Just like we say regarding hefker, that we treat it as if someone owns it, and that establishes the tchum. How much more so over here regarding the salt and the water that's actually owned by someone and you borrowed it here on Yontif? For sure, this tchum should be established not only according to the ingredients of the dough, but also according to the ingredients of this salt and water that's inside the dough. How could it become batal b'raiv? That's the point that Rav Safra is asking. Okay, so now after this entire discussion, so Rav Safra disproved the point of Abaye. Abaye comes back and says, I really disagree to the entire premise of this whole thing. We're discussing Erev Tchumen with the premise of that this is an issue of ownership. And we're discussing whether Bittul B'Raiv applies to ownership or it does not apply to ownership. But really, Abaye now comes and says, this is not an issue of ownership whatsoever. Amalei, so Abaye says, Mi kamedames isur l'mamayna. Why are you at all comparing an issue of Bittul B'Raiv regarding Isser to an issue of Bittul B'Raiv regarding money? Isura batal, when it comes to an Isser, there's Bittul B'Raiv. Memayna lay batal. When it comes to a matter of money, there's no such a thing as Bittul B'Raiv. It's two totally different things. So therefore, after all of this, what Abaye in essence is saying is, even if it's true that the Erev Tchumen is determined by ownership, it's determined by the ownership. But what's the actual halacha that this applies to the Isser of walking out of the Tchum? So we're not discussing the rights of the owner that he has to the object. That's not the discussion. The ownership, the actual ownership itself is not relevant. The ownership will determine the Tchum. But the actual halacha that it matters to us is the Isser of Tchumen. So in the end of the day, what Abaye is saying is this is a subject of Isser. The fact that the Isser is determined by ownership doesn't make a difference. In the end of the day, the actual psak halacha we're dealing with is the Isser of Tchumen. If so, in the end of the day, this is a matter of Isser. And therefore the halacha of Bittul B'Raiv should apply. And therefore the question of the Chachamim regarding our Mishnah, why Bittul Chachamim in Eretz Yisrael, all those group of Chachamim that were there, why Bittul B'Raiv doesn't apply there is a valid question. And Rab Abba's answer that this is a question of ownership and therefore Bittul B'Raiv doesn't apply is incorrect, Abaye says. Over here, in the end of the day, this is an issue of Isser. So therefore, after all of this, the question of the Chachamim is a valid question. So the Gemara therefore says, V'taim emai. So what in fact is the reason why it's not Batal B'Raiv? Abaye Omar, so Abaye says, Gzeire shemetase isse b'shutfis. Over here there's a Gzeiras Chazal. True, Minatayre it should be Batal B'Raiv, because it is a matter of Isser. But the Gzeira of Chazal is, in this case, if you're going to say Batal B'Raiv because you mixed the minority of ingredients, a woman might think that if she's going to knead a dough with her friend B'Shutvis, that in such a case also, maybe each one could take it to their own Tchum, just like in another case we said Batal B'Raiv, and I was able to take it to my Tchum, she'll think that she could take her part to wherever she wants to go. And you can't, because there it's mamish a partnership. So this is the Gzeira of Chazal. Rava says, and then as Rashi explains, Rava is not arguing. Abaye's answer explained regarding the salt and the water, and Rava is giving a reason that applies to the mixture of spices into the food that was being cooked in a pot. Tavlin, when it comes to spices, so over here there's no din of bittul because letaima avidi. The spices is made to give taste to the entire food. V'taimele bottle, something that's made to give taste to the entire food has a significance, has a chshivus, and therefore it's not going to be bottle. V'Ravashi Amar, Ravashi gives a third answer. Over here there's no bittul b'raiv, mishum dahavale davar sheyesh lo matirin. because this is something which is a davar shesh lematirin. If you can't take it to this location out of the tchum, out of your tchum today, you can take it there tomorrow. The whole concept of tchum is only on Yontif. So this is a davar shesh lematirin, as we learned already in the first Perek. V'chol davar shesh lematirin afilu be'elef le'batel. By a davar shesh lematirin, there is no concept of bittul beroiv, and therefore bittul beroiv cannot apply over here.